Hi, I'm Pastor Jack Hughes of Anchor Bible Church, and I thought I would diagram another text. This one here will be especially encouraging to preachers. In I Thessalonians chapter 2, we have a pericope or a paragraph that runs from verse 1 down to verse 8. You can see the bold letter here, which tells you another paragraph or pericope is starting. So this is in the NASB. And I've already diagrammed the first 4 verses. A lot of times when the pericope is big, I can't fit it on the palette very easily without making it really tiny. And so I a lot of times break it up into, 3 or 4 verse pieces. And I've already done that. Let me just show you. So this right here is, already diagrammed. This is 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 4. And I just want to show you how amazing this is. So in the preceding context, so in chapter 1, Paul talks about we give thanks, and starting in verse 2, and the whole rest of the chapter are all the things that the Apostle Paul was thankful for the Thessalonian believers. And then in chapter 2, he begins to speak about his preaching ministry. And that's why it's especially encouraging to preachers. It's good for everybody because even congregants need to know how preachers need to preach, and they need to know how to pray for their preacher, how to encourage their preacher, and if they're looking for a preacher, they need to find one that God wants, not a guy that they want. They shouldn't go off of personality and things like that. They should go off what God says a man needs to be in order to be a preacher. So let's just look at the first 4 verses, which I've already done, and then we'll diagram the last verses 5 through 8. So here we have this fun text, preach to please God, not men. And notice how the text is broken up. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. So this is kind of his opening statement. Preaching the gospel bore fruit. It wasn't vain. It wasn't worthless. It wasn't empty. And he uses a perfect here when he says you yourselves know, which means you knew at a point in the past, and that knowledge continues to the present. And he says, not in vain, but in contrast to preaching in vain, after we had already suffered and after we had already been mistreated in Philippi, as you know. So he goes back and starts speaking of, Acts 16, when they were persecuted and what happened there. That didn't discourage him. But he wants them to know, even though we had suffered before, even though we were mistreated in Philippi right before coming to you, we still came to you to preach the gospel, even though before it had brought great grief upon us. We had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amidst much opposition. So now he's speaking of opposition even in Thessalonica. He didn't just preach the gospel, he preached the gospel with boldness. That's how God wants us to preach. Preaching should be with boldness. He says, for our exhortation did not come from error or impurity or by way of a seat. So this right here, these 3, along with this right here, not pleasing men, are 4 marks of God-glorifying preaching, which is kind of fun. And also, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak. Notice preachers need to be approved by God. They need to be saved and gifted and called and trained and hopefully appointed by other men who have been appointed by other men who are faithful. The preacher's motive should be to please God, not men. So if you have an outline of this is what I came up with, kind of 8 points for the preacher. Preach expecting fruit, which I got here. We preach not in vain. Preach in the face of persecution. He talks about the suffering here that they received when preaching the gospel in Philippi. Preach without error. Why? Our exhortation does not come from error. Preach without impurity. Our exhortation does not come in purity. They weren't trying to seduce people and, use the gospel for filthy, sensual, sexual purposes or anything like that. Preach without deceit. Notice not to get rich, not to pretend to be something you're not. This is really a critical one because you can be an accurate preacher and preach sound doctrine and handle the text accurately and still preach in deceit if your life is a lie, if you're living in sin, if you're being a hypocrite. So don't preach in deceit. Preach with God's approval. We have been approved by God, which means match up to everything God wants you to be before you become a preacher. Preach without trying to please men. Notice, not as pleasing men. And preach to the glory of God. How do we know that? The God who examines our heart. So since God is examining our heart, we want to make sure we're preaching to His glory and we're submitting to His word, not only in what we preach, but how God tells us to preach. And that's how we preach to His glory. All right, so that is the first part. And now we're going to diagram the second part, which continues to speak about Paul's preaching ministry to the Thessalonians. So let's look here and see what we can find out here. We're going to do verses 5 through 8. So what we just looked at is the first part of the pericope, and we're going to continue in verses 5 through 8. So I'm just going to start into it. I'm going to talk about it basically, and then I'm going to speed it up and just make a few comments at the end. So bear with me as I focus on the text for a little bit. I'm going to go to Tool, Sentence Diagrammer, and we're going to do verse 2, 5 through 8. I always put an asterisk here. That tells me that I'm going to put an outline on it. So I just do that for my own little weirdness. First Thess 2, 5 through 8. There we go. That text. Insert. There we have it. And I'm going to grab this and pull this out a little bit. It doesn't get in the way. All right, so now I'm going to break down this text. I know that it's the second half of the pericope. I need to keep that in mind because the whole thing is kind of a single unit of thought. It's all about preaching, but different things are addressed, kind of the motives of preaching and what is avoided in preaching and the power of preaching. So Paul deals with a lot of neat things. But here, let's just look and see what the text says. For, and which is continual thought, and we're still talking about preaching. We never came with flattering speech. Okay? Then he has this little statement, as you know. Okay? That is just kind of a parenthesis. Nor implied, nor what? Nor did we come, basically. We never came, nor we never came, but I'd probably I'm just going to put in brackets there. But notice how the withs are lined up here. They also didn't come with a pretext for greed. And just as it says, as you know, here it says, God is witness. Then we have another one, nor what? Did we seek glory from men? Okay, and then he breaks down what he means by that. Either from you, and we will put this here, bring this over here, or from others. Either from you or from others. Even though as apostles, and this is kind of another statement, notice how in all these statements, we never came with spattered feet, and then a little comment, as you know. We never came with a pretext for greed. God is witness. We did not seek glory from men, either from you or others. Even those apostles, we might have and asserted our authority. Notice how all these things are just kind of little parenthetical statements just stuck on the end, just little comments to clarify what he's talking about. So this statement here is actually flows from these two statements, which is we didn't seek glory from men, which relates to what happens in the near preceding context, as we saw, where he says, not, verse 4, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. So there you have it. So I'm still kind of just breaking down the text. I'm dragging around. So this right here, since this is a long statement, I'm going to bring this over here, and then we'll do a wraparound so we can kind of get it there. We might have asserted our authority. Then, but what? Well, here we go. We proved to be gentle among you. And now he's going to say, in what way were you gentle? Well, we were as gentle as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. And then he goes on, having so fond an affection for you. So here is a statement that kind of flows from, we prove to be gentle among you. And this is, as a nursing mother cares for her own children. So since this right here, it kind of just flows, and there isn't two of them, there isn't multiple things, this statement here, having so fond an affection, is really a summary of this statement, right? Because a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children, and verse 8 is a restatement of that, having so fond an affection for you. So I'm just going to put this here. I'm going to put this down right here, and we'll put an arrow kind of connecting these, since this is kind of the summary. This is actually a participle, but it's just a different way of stating this, having so fond an affection for you. And because that affection, because they were like nursing mother tenderly caring for her children, we were well pleased to impart to you. Okay? And you're saying, okay, we were apart to you what? Well, a couple different things, and we have to wrap it around because we don't have enough to go off the page. Not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives. Why? Because you had become very dear for us. Okay, so right here is basically the text. I'm going to go back and kind of check it again so I can see if it is flowing right and I have things stated. So here's kind of the conjunctions, but we have kind of a major statement. We never came with flattering speech, as you know. Secondly, we never came with a pretext for greed. God is our witness. Thirdly, we didn't seek glory from men. We didn't seek glory from you. We didn't seek glory from others. Even though, by the way, as apostles of Christ, we might have asserted our authority, implied we didn't do it. But we did prove to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother cares for her own children. Then we have this statement here, which actually flows from this one here, is just kind of a statement. We had so fond affection for you, we were pleased to impart to you what? Two things. Not only the gospel of God, but our own lives. And then a motive. What was the motive that they did this? You had become very dear to us. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to make it look nice. I'll fast forward it and just make a few comments, and we'll close shop. All right, let me just show you here what I'm doing. I'm highlighting all the verbs, at least I think they are. I'm just kind of looking at all the verbs. Sometimes it's not exactly clear which ones are verbs, and then I go back. When I go back, I'm looking at the bottom of the text here where it shows you whether something is a verb or not. So I'm kind of double checking all the things I've highlighted, making adjustments, making sure I don't turn an adjective or something into a verb, because I like to make all my verbs in red. If it's an implied verb, like what says God is witness, I do that in italics. You'll see that in just a second. So anyways, now I'm just going through the text, and I'm, marking it up and making it look more precise here. We didn't see glory either, and then it's from you and from others. It just makes it look nicer. So I did that and kind of did all the yous in one color and Paul in another color, and the sins, flattering speech, pretext for greed, glory from men, did those in black bold, because those are mean and nasty things to avoid or whatever. So I just kind of have a way that I do it, and then I kind of put all the lines in to make everything. So right now I'm just kind of making sure everything's color-coded, and I like to do this before the lines, because if you bold the text when you're, or if you put the lines in and then you make the text bold, what'll happen is it will, the lines won't match up anymore because the bold takes more time. So anyways, I'm just adjusting it, just making it look pretty, but it's not a big deal. So adding some little implied phrases in there so you can see how I do it and whatever. I'm going to tweak on it even a little bit more after I get this done and italicize everything, but I'm just trying to do this quickly so you can see. I'm trying to think of a good title here. So this is how I'm doing it. How and how not to preach. There you go. And now I'm just going through the major phrases, phrase by phrase, and I'm lining them up because these things are being, now if I was preaching, I would definitely reword these and probably make them shorter and more concise, and you can alliterate them or whatever you want to do, but that's what I'm doing there. So hope that helps. Okay, well, there we have it. So what I did is I went through the text, colored it all up, kind of marked the verbs, and you can see how I kind of went back and forth and did that. But notice how much this adds to the 8 other points of preaching. So we have in the first 4 verses these 8 different ways or criteria of preaching, but notice these also. You need to not flatter people. Paul says we didn't come with flattering speech. Don't preach with greedy motives. We did not come with the pretext for greed. Don't preach to get yourself glory, nor did we seek glory. And then this right here describes that in more detail, either from you or for others, even though we could have asserted our authority as apostles. They didn't do that. They didn't seek glory. Notice also, be gentle with those you preach to. And here, we prove to be gentle among you. And then he explains, gives an analogy like a nursing mother who cares for her own children. And then because they had an affection like a nursing mother cares for her own children, they imparted 2 things. They preached the gospel. They imparted them the gospel, preached the gospel, and they gave them their whole lives. Give your whole lives to those you preach to. So notice we have 6 more criteria or characteristics of the God-glorifying preacher. How and how not to preach in a way that glorifies God. So I hope this was helpful, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
DrivenNails.com is a user-supported ministry.